Welcome to Human Monsters. Prologue. Time waits for no man. Time might seem relative when 5 minutes in a lineup can feel like an hour, while an hour with a lover can feel like 5 minutes. But at the end of the day, with every tick of the clock, we are growing older and older. In our teens and even our 20s, the idea of one day being elderly seems so far removed from our minds that we hardly give it any thought. It's unfortunately as inevitable as death, and with old age comes challenges and problems most of us are ill-prepared for. Words on pages become dimmer, movement becomes slower, and voices and other sounds harder to hear as the wrinkles in the mirror declare the unforgiving traces of time. The elderly are indeed one of these sectors of our society that are very vulnerable. I have the deepest compassion and respect for them because they have lived their lives, accomplished goals, and have endless stories to tell. It's not uncommon for emergency services to be alerted to an apartment or other dwelling because the old man who lives there has not been seen in weeks and the smell of decomposition is hanging heavily in the air. Many old folks are just forgotten, apart from the odd phone call on Christmas Day. It's a heartbreaking reality, but not all old people are completely helpless and fragile. Have you ever gone to a shop or a supermarket on Pensioners' Day? When I see a sea of gray hair, something inside of me wants to shout out, "Turn around now and save myself." Seldom do I return from the excursion without having had an argument about the last discounted can of peas with a silver-haired lady, being passively aggressively threatened with a cane or a walking stick to surrender my place at the checkout till. Or do I return home with a new bruise on my shin from nearsighted elderly shoppers who use their shopping carts as ramming tools? If you have a compassionate heart, it is easy to see nothing more than someone defenseless and harmless. But true crime has taught us that ladies like Dorothea Puentes, Nanny Doss, and Tamara Samsonova, who we have covered in previous episodes, would smile at you in a disarming way while planning your murder and how they are going to dispose of your body. In today's episode, I want to tell you about two grandmothers who were clearly underestimated, and when they finally had enough, both would kill someone without remorse. So, without further hesitation, let me tell you what happens when Grandma has had enough. Part 1. The Ghetto Grandma. They say you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. This is even more true when it comes to in-laws. When personalities clash within the family dynamic, the best possible resort is to avoid interaction, and when forced to congregate, to just be civil, if you can't be polite. When family members have to share accommodation, this dynamic becomes a bit more tricky to navigate. But for 15 years, Cynthia Kadabaka seemed to be able to hold her place in the household of her daughter and son-in-law successfully. It would take one slight comment that would change the trajectory of this family forever. Cynthia Kadabaka is described as a jovial, charismatic, and outspoken woman full of life. The shocking events of 9/11, however, did not only devastate her, as it did most people around the world. It was also the day she suffered a major stroke and found herself unable to function the way she did before. The stroke not only affected her speech and balance, but rendered her walk with a gait, which she had to counter with a walking stick. Her only daughter, Laura, knew that Cynthia had recently lost her husband, and she was concerned about her mother's well-being. She was her mother's only child, and despite the fact that she had only been married for a couple of months, the best possible plan was for her mother to live with her and her new husband. The decision was made, and in 2001, Cynthia moved in with her daughter and her husband, Gioward Estocchio. Gioward was a successful real estate agent, and the family had a beautiful and massive home in the gated community Fallbrook, San Diego. Cynthia was given the granny flat above the garage to use as her own quarters, and soon the family grew. Gioward already had 2 sons from a previous marriage, of which the 18-year-old lived with them. By the time the crime we are going to discuss was committed, the couple also had a 14-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl. From the onset, Gioward and Cynthia's personalities clashed. Gioward was structured and disciplined, while Cynthia had a more carefree attitude to life. Gioward was a military reservist, and players from the local rugby team he coached would say he was very strict and no-nonsense in his training of them. At home, Gioward was a very strict disciplinarian. Official statements from family members would later state that he not only would berate and verbally abuse all members of the family, but that he beat his children with a belt. Cynthia was also a chain smoker, which annoyed Gioward to the ends of the earth. He forbade her to smoke inside the house, but even when she was outside having a cigarette, he would grab the hose and spray her with water. I don't mean in a playful way. He would regularly drench her, and when Laura intervened, she would get drenched. He would claim that if he saw smoke, he just had to put it out. He also had a spray bottle in the house, which he used to discipline the dogs with, and would just randomly spray anyone in the face with water. Cynthia had also started to notice bruises on her daughter, and Gioward would apparently frequently choke Laura. Cynthia's niece would also later claim that Laura confessed that Gioward would anally rape her because that was, according to him, the only way he could climax. Reports vary about what triggered the 63-year-old grandmother to buy a .38 revolver, but weeks before the crime, Cynthia purchased the weapon and started to attend a shooting range regularly. She seemed to have had enough of the physical and verbal abuse Gioward was constantly dishing out to his children and his wife. It's also unclear if anyone knew of this recent purchase. Laura woke her mother up with birthday wishes and some money to go gambling, which was one of Cynthia's favorite means of entertainment. Cynthia had planned to go to her granddaughter's spelling bee and afterwards spend the afternoon with her niece. She was supposed to travel to the competition with Gioward, but when she came down the stairs and he caught sight of what she was wearing, he called her ghetto and started to heckle her. Granted, the red and orange skirt paired with a purple LA Chargers jersey with the number 22 on it was an odd choice of clothing, but at that moment, Cynthia had enough. It was her 63rd birthday, and she was going to wear whatever she wanted. She went back to her apartment and fetched her loaded gun from her bedside. As her 53-year-old son-in-law was carrying the laundry, Cynthia aimed and shot him 5 times in the back. As Gioward fell to the ground, Cynthia waddled to her car, where she kept her bullets. She reloaded and returned to shoot Gioward 5 more times. When the gun was empty, she once again returned to her car to reload. Gioward had, after the second attack, been able to enter the kitchen and lock the door, but Cynthia was not done. She shot through the door, hitting him 2 more times. She then picked up the cartridges, disposed of the gun, and then had a bacon and egg breakfast at Denny's. Cynthia made her way to the casino, where she gambled for 2 hours, and she would end her day at her favorite coffee shop, where police arrested her. The attack, which had begun at about 8 a.m., had caused numerous neighbors to call the police, and many would recall hearing someone call for help. Gioward's 18-year-old son was originally the main suspect, as he had some problems in the past caused by a drug addiction. Once investigators sat down with Cynthia, it did not take long for her to confess. When they first informed her Georg was dead, she pretended rather badly to cry. The officers then asked her what she thought of him, to which she showed a big thumbs down. Cynthia would tell officers that he was mean. The interview is honestly a testimony of what an unremorseful person would look like. The officers baited her by asking her if someone had to stop him, to which she answered, "I did." She then asked if Georg was really dead, and when they confirmed this to her, she broke out in a dance, raising her hands to the sky as if she were at a revival church meeting, and shouted, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy." Unbeknownst to her, her family had been watching the entire time from the other room through a two-way mirror. She was allowed to say goodbye to her family. Laura was clearly devastated, and when Cynthia asked her granddaughter for a kiss, the child responded, "No, you killed my dad." The trial took 3 years to commence. Cynthia was evaluated by a psychiatrist and found competent. During the trial, her family, including Laura, testified on her behalf, but the premeditation and complete lack of remorse sealed her fate. After deliberating for 2 days, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison. She will be eligible for parole in February 2039. Part 2. The Bubble and Squeak Murder. The road to true love seldom runs smooth, but despite the vows we take to stay together forever, no matter what, before our deities, family, and friends in a formal setting, or if we do so in the privacy of an intimate moment, the reality is that some people should just call it a day and walk away, especially when words of endearment are exchanged for digs and criticisms, and a partner bears the signs of what could only have been a physical altercation. We all know those couples who individually seem like decent people, but together in a relationship, they create two forces of nature that are perfect for natural disasters. Whether they exhibit their toxic relationship in the subtle art of passive-aggressive remarks, or if the conflict escalates into a full-on violent interaction, your instincts just know these two people should not be together. Some of us have even been in the unfortunate position of being in a relationship where the bad times outweigh the good, so much that it unfortunately becomes the norm. If you have been lucky enough to have never been in love with someone who brings out the absolute worst in you, count your lucky stars and don't be quick to judge. Exiting a toxic relationship is not as easy as packing a bag and signing divorce papers. In a study on domestic violence by the United Nations, a partner will on average leave a dysfunctional relationship they have been in long term an average of 8 times before they finally break all ties and never return to a poisonous partnership that to some becomes almost addictive. The question that always baffles us is that if the relationship is that awful, why stay? Because the heart wants what the heart wants, and in its desire it becomes blind to the reality. We don't usually have a disclaimer, but today we feel it's important that you all understand that we have the deepest compassion for people who suffer from domestic violence, substance abuse, and depression, or other mental illness. We tell these stories because they are cautionary tales, and if you can walk away a little entertained and enlightened, our job is done. Elderly couples are usually held in high regard, typically because most of us wonder how they could have sustained a relationship for so long. That might be one of the reasons audiences were shocked and amazed when a Somerset woman's mugshot appeared on their television and news feeds in connection with the murder of her husband. What amplified the debate about this case was the video footage released afterwards, because instead of a remorseful and distraught, recently widowed woman, Viewers saw a drunk, angry woman, very happy that her husband is dead and that she had killed him. If there was a case that ignited a debate surrounding the effects of the pandemic lockdown and whether murder was the effect of long-term abuse, it was the slaying of 78-year-old David Jackson by his 66-year-old wife, Penelope Jackson, also known as Penny. Despite the buzz the crime ignited on newsreels across the world, the time between the actual crime and the final verdict was surprisingly short. Still, the circumstances and attitude of the accused was so unbelievable that the story deserves to be told. At first glance, the elderly couple seemed like any ordinary happily retired pair, but the duo showed cracks in their relationship early on. The couple shared a home in Somerset, England, which is a very upmarket area, known for its beautiful landscapes and properties. Between the two of them, they managed to say their marriage vows a total of 7 times. Penelope wore her first wedding gown when she was only 18 years old. Her marriage, which happened in 1973, was, however, short-lived, and Penelope would claim that her first husband was incredibly abusive, which forced her to leave the marriage with their 2 young daughters. She then went on to follow an administrative and accounting career in the Royal Air Force, where she met her second husband. Unfortunately, he turned out to be gay, and the couple called it quits not long after they tied the knot. Despite being disappointed in love twice before, Penelope fell in love with an RAF pilot, only known to us as Alan, and decided to give matrimony one more chance. Alan had to spend much time away from home, and as a result, and perhaps because her view about love was a bit jaded, Penelope started to have an affair. Alan soon discovered the infidelity and, devastated by the news, took his own life by carbon dioxide poisoning. The man she was having an affair with was David Jackson. David, who had risen through the ranks of the armed forces from private to lieutenant colonel, had 3 marriages under his belt. He met Penelope while he was still married to his second wife, and the two continued their adulterous affair until his wife died from cancer. It would not be David's first affair, and each of his marriages ended because of infidelity. Sadly, she discovered the betrayal shortly before she passed away. At the young age of 36, shortly after her death, David and Penelope would say, "I do," one last time. From the outside, the couple's 18-year marriage appeared harmonious, with plenty of world cruises and living abroad in France and Germany, with summers spent in Spain. David was the more quiet of the two, with Penelope the more social and outgoing. Both are also described as being active, and both had strong personalities. His children described David as a traditional man who was a very good father and grandfather. David even adopted Isabella, Penelope's daughter, from her previous marriage. Those who knew them well would see the cracks in the relationship appear soon after the wedding in 1996. Jane, David's daughter, was very vocal about how she perceived her new stepmother. She describes Penelope as a bit of a bitch, always ready to criticize and make snide and demeaning remarks in company. Penelope is described as passive-aggressive and often threw insults on the sly. During a time of turmoil in her own relationship, Jane had stayed with the couple and was taken aback when Penelope told her that the best outcome for her would be to have her husband commit suicide. Jane stated that her father did not want to leave because apparently he was afraid to. Penelope had threatened to cut off David's dick if he left, according to Jane. At the end of the day, we must realize all opinions about the behavior of the couple were subjective, and David and Penelope knew the real truth about their marital status. The first blow to the marriage happened 2 years into the union, when David's only son, Gavin, decided to take his own life. He had had an affair while his wife was pregnant, and the guilt had ridden a hole in his soul so big that he could no longer continue living. What caused the most hurt to David was that in his suicide note, Gavin says he did not want to be like his father, and that is why he decided to take his life. This letter devastated David, and it would appear as if he started to resent Penelope from this point on. Of all the stages of grief, anger is the most destructive to get stuck upon. The couple would continue to stay married for the next 16 years, despite this tragedy. David became abusive, and Isabella would tell of an incident when she came home from school and found her mother bleeding from her nose after David had slammed her face into a wall. Family members also had to pull him off Penelope at a gathering in Germany after David attacked her in front of their kin. He had also held a knife to her neck and threatened to kill her. David did take responsibility for his behavior, and he did seek therapy. Isabella would later claim that it was not unusual for the couple to constantly bicker, but no one would have foreseen what would happen and how this tale would end. The incident that preceded the main event happened 2 days before Christmas, on December 23, 2020, when Penelope and David began arguing and David threatened her with a poker. He also managed to break one of the windows in the house. The argument erupted as a result of the age-old question of who is in charge of the remote control of the television. Fearing for her safety, Penelope locked him in the conservatory and called the local police station for assistance. No charges were made, but the couple were separated, and David opted to leave the house. He did, however, shortly afterwards, return, after Penelope called him and asked him to come back. She claimed that she stated that his behavior was out of character and that she suspected it was a result of an implant David had in his head to control a tremor David had developed that was set off the wrong frequency. David did return to his doctor, and the problem was rectified. The couple seemed to have enjoyed a happy, loving, and festive Christmas together. On February 13th, 2021, which was Penelope's birthday, the couple would have much rather been able to spend the day with their daughter Isabella and her husband Tom Potterton, but due to the lockdown restrictions, the young couple were stranded in Germany. They decided to celebrate Penelope's birthday by sending the couple gourmet food and champagne, and like many other families across the world, shared the happy occasion across a Zoom call. The first sign of trouble came when the iPad they were using ran out of battery power, and they could not find the charger. Isabella just rolled her eyes, because the couple had become notorious for their constant bickering. The dinner did, however, continue, and was reported to have lasted about 4 hours. For starters, the couple enjoyed lobster, and for the main course, Penelope prepared a couple of prime pieces of steak, which she decided to pair with a dish called Bubble and Squeak, which essentially is potato and cabbage, compressed and deep fried. Once again, tempers started to flare because David thought the side dish, which is often seen as a more working-class side, was an insult to the fantastic food they were sharing. Isabella said that at that point, the screen went blank, and she assumed that the battery on the iPad had finally run out. Isabella, after receiving a strange message from her mother later in the evening, called her mother to check if she was doing okay. The message, in short, said, "If everything goes tits up tonight, just remember I love you." Penelope, who was known to love her white wine, reassured her daughter that everything was fine. Despite her assurance, she decided to take a knife from the kitchen and put it under her pillow. Whether she wanted to take her own life or use it for her own protection is unclear. David discovered the knife under her pillow, and Penelope claimed that he started to taunt and belittle her. The argument moved to the spare room, where it seemed David had chosen to spend the rest of the evening. Somehow the argument escalated, and while David taunted Penelope, telling her she would never stab him, something inside the elderly lady snapped, and she plunged the knife into where she believed his heart would be. David, while still conscious and mobile, moved into the kitchen and called emergency services. The 999 call recording is something that seems almost surreal. At first, David is on the call, describing that his wife had stabbed him. Penelope then takes over the call, and the two are heard still arguing, with David telling her she would not stab him again, which she promptly did in his stomach 2 more times. On the call, David can be heard in agony on the kitchen floor as he is bleeding to death. Penelope's demeanor and reaction on the call and during her arrest is so bizarre and shocking that it almost seems unreal. She tells the operator that she thinks she stabbed him in his heart, although she does not think he has one. She also threatens to stab him again, to which the operator politely asks her not to. He tries to instruct her to do CPR, but she firmly refuses to get a towel or apply any kind of pressure on the wounds or try to close the gaping holes she had created in her husband's body. During the call and on the body cam footage, Penelope, who is known to love her white wine, is clearly a little intoxicated. But, according to her, she is compos mentis and clear of mind. When emergency services finally arrived 18 minutes later, she tells them that David was a bully and an abusive husband and that he deserved to die. She complained that her husband was violent and controlling and that he had managed to ruin her special celebratory dinner. The elderly woman, still clad in her pajamas, was placed in the back of a police vehicle and at that stage was charged with attempted murder. She was more concerned with retrieving her coat than with the life of the man she shared 18 years with. When she was finally told David had passed away, she exclaimed, "Oh, good." Inside the house, police found a suicide note Penelope had written, more than likely while waiting for the police. It stated that she had taken so much abuse and that the abuse had actually been recorded. She accepted her punishment and made David rot in hell. In the body cam, you can hear her say in a slightly slurred speech that she accepts whatever awaits her and that prison will be better than the hell her life had been to that point. What would also not count in her favor during court proceedings was when she tried to stop EMTs from administering first aid, stating that she now regrets not having stabbed him a couple more times. Her complete lack of remorse and other strange behavior did not help her case in the Bristol court. On April 29, 2021, a jury decided after deliberating for 11 hours, with a vote of 10-2, to find her guilty of murder. She was given an 18-year sentence, which means she will be 84 before she will be able to apply for parole. The case has been heavily debated in all the media platforms. What shocked almost everyone is how, without remorse, she shows, not only by refusing to assist him in his dying hour, but her pure joy when she was told her husband was dead. I have no doubt alcohol played a major part in the animosity that had clearly been building and culminating for some time. Statistically, relationships forged from the infidelity usually are more prone than any other to fail. Still, a divorce seems more of a solution than killing the man you called your husband. Now Penelope Jackson faces the rest of her life behind bars, while both her family and his family tries to make sense of not just a beloved patriarch's death, but the callous manner in which the murder was committed. Most of us will not have to suffer the after effects of a toxic relationship in public, the way the dissolved marriage of Amber Heard and Johnny Depp has been, but I don't believe anyone can walk away from a toxic relationship without some kind of trauma. Your dirty laundry might not be aired on every type of screen imaginable, but the damage shows in the lack of trust we tend to have after a bad match. Personally, I believe that it's better to be alone for the right reasons than remain with someone for the wrong reasons. But if you decide to follow your heart, be careful and take your time. Walking away might be difficult, but it beats an indefinite stay in prison and the blood of your lover on your hands. As previously stated, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. We all have that odd character that shows up at weddings and funerals, who is gossiped about. Perhaps that person might even be you. Every now and again, however, a family can produce a member that does much more than get embarrassingly drunk at the reception, or the kind that is always the one that provokes the family feuds. The following subjects betrayed their loved ones on such an incomprehensible level that each story will send a shiver down your spine. In the category of mass murderers, it's alarming to find that the most prevalent is the family annihilators. As you will see, it's a worldwide problem, but still, there are distinct similarities between the crimes. The overwhelming majority of family annihilators are male, and they all have narcissistic or antisocial personality disorders. They view the members of their family as their property to do with as they please. Most of these murderers seem like ordinary law-abiding citizens, and in every case, there is a clear indication of premeditation. The crimes mostly occurred over a weekend or on a holiday. They also often have a history of sexual and physical abuse, either in their own childhood or later within their own families. Motives vary, but what most often jumps out is a breakdown of the family structure. Over 40% were, at the beginning, or in the process of separation. At the end of the day, all crimes boil down to three motives: love, money, or pride. Our case subjects have different motives and even live on different continents. But as you will see, the callous decision to rather exterminate one's entire family than face up to the consequences of one's actions remains the same. Familicide is often driven by toxic masculinity and usually triggered by an event. There is still so much more to be learned about this frightening phenomenon, and far be it for any of us to judge anyone's actions. You might be able to fool some of the people some of the time, but it's impossible to fool all the people all of the time. In the cases we talk about today, there is no doubt in my mind that these men finally acted out the dark, true nature of their base being. These are the two stories of families who lived with a monster under the same roof. Some called him dad, some called him brother, and some called him son. But in the end, all they were murderers. Part 1. The Pretender. The year 2002 had been a roller coaster for Michael Finkel. First, he was riding high, earning himself 10 out of 12 covers of the New York Times magazine for stories he had written. Later, he was a disgraced journalist whose work no one would touch. Granted, he had become a little too fast and loose with the facts in his last story, but not for one moment did Michael think he would be found out. It did not take long for the editors to realize his facts were not checked, and he was not only fired, but effectively blackballed in the journalism community. As he was hiding out in the mountains of Montana with his wife one morning, still licking his wounds while making a sandwich, the telephone rang next to him. He did not pick up the phone as a rule these days, because his one act of journalism deceit had afforded him a notoriety no one wants. This time, however, for whatever reason, he did pick up the phone, and as he listened to the incredible story on the other end of the line, Michael knew the gods had thrown him a lifeline, and that his days as a scribe were far from over. Before I tell you about the redemption of Michael Finkel, I must first tell you about the Longo family and the man who would inevitably kill each and every member of his perfect little household. Christian Michael Stewart was born in Iowa on January 23, 1974, to circumstances that were less than ideal. His mother, Joy, was a teenage mother, and Christian's father was an abusive alcoholic. He beat Joy while she was pregnant, especially with Christian's baby brother, Dustin, and even gave Christian a black eye for making a mess while eating while he was only 2 years old. She would leave this abusive spouse and meet Joe Longo at the Target where he was employed. Joe Longo was a good man and a great father by all accounts. He adopted the children and gave them his last name. Joy was a homemaker and the family was happy and well-adjusted. When Christian was 10 years old, a Jehovah's Witness came to her door, and Joy allowed them in and listened to what they had to say. Although she was Catholic, something about the way the Jehovah's Witnesses carried themselves and their principles spoke to her, and soon she was deeply involved, along with her entire family. The Jehovah's Witnesses have very strict rules. Members can only associate with other members, and divorce and infidelity could get you shunned. Birthdays and Christmases were also not celebrated. The dogma was strict, and the organization's members only interacted with each other. There were no sports allowed, nor could the children go to sleepovers or go to parties. This created a sheltered environment for the children. They were also not allowed to date or play with non-believers. Chris loved the meetings and going door to door as a witness to his faith. At age 11, he proved himself a good speaker and would often be called to the front of the church to deliver a message. He was a confident and attractive young man, but trouble had started to brew early. It started at his local school. He hacked a computer at his school to change his grades, but was soon found out. This convinced his mother that homeschooling would be the best for her 2 boys, despite the fact that she was completely ill-prepared for the role as a teacher. Her teachings mostly revolved around religious doctrine, and as a result, Christian received his high school diploma. In 1990, the family moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan. They immediately connected with church members of the area, and it was here that Christian would meet a beautiful older woman he would fall in love with. Christian was 18 years old when he met the beautiful Mary Jane Baker at church. She was born on April 25, 1967, to a devoted family with loving parents and 4 other siblings. She was working at a dentistry school as a secretary, and despite being a little meek and mild, she was also very intelligent. All Mary Jane wanted was to be a mother and wife, and in Christian she saw the perfect husband, or so she thought. The 7 years difference really bothered Christian's parents, but Mary Jane's parents thought the well-mannered and well-dressed young man was everything they could have asked for in a partner. Christian was working part-time at a camera shop, and after his parents told him that if he continued to date Mary Jane, he would not be welcome in their home, he found an apartment with a couple of other Jehovah's Witnesses members. Nothing would stand in the 2 lovers' way, and during a trip to Brooklyn, New York, Christian proposed with a ring he bought on credit for $3,000. Christian had always liked the finer things in life, but he quickly realized that this purchase would mean he had no money for rent or to live off. One afternoon, he took the bold step to steal money from his employer. He immediately paid the installment on the ring the following morning. Christian dropped the money he had taken as well as his letter of resignation off at the shop. The owner was undeterred and filed a police report. He was arrested, and when the elders of this church found out, he was placed on what is referred to as restrictions. To Mary Jane, who forgave her future husband, the worst of these restrictions was that they were not allowed to get married in the Kingdom of God temple, which was a big deal to any woman of the faith. Christian apologized as if his life depended on it, and promised something like this would never happen again, and Mary Jane believed him. The two were married on March 13th, 1993, and Christian's parents, who by now had accepted the union, even helped to pay for the wedding. From the very beginning, it was clear that Mary Jane respected her husband and that he was in charge of everything. Many doubted if she was as unaware as she seemed to be, as Christian made one bad decision after another. But she was sheltered all her life, and from the day she was born, she was taught to listen to and obey her husband. The two newlyweds got a small apartment, but instead of being frugal, they bought the best furniture and appliances for the new home. Christian managed to find better employment and earn more. He worked for Publication Circulation Fulfillment, a company that distributed publications such as the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. In essence, he was a newspaper delivery man, but Christian would tell friends and neighbors that he worked for the New York Times. Despite the increase in salary, he was still not earning enough for the lifestyle he thought they deserved. Christian bought a camera, computer, pool table, and spent as if there was no tomorrow. His spending would catch up with him, and within the first year, one of his landlords would sue him for unpaid rent. His credit card was maxed out, but still Christian continued to lie to his family and friends, claiming that he earned a very good salary and that all is well. By now, Christian must have known that his impulsive spending and the need to keep up with the Joneses was spiraling out of control. Mary Jane gave birth to their first child, a boy named Zachary, born in 1997. Christian had received a promotion, which probably made Mary Jane feel that their finances were in control. They bought a new car and purchased a house from Mary Jane's parents. Sadie was born shortly after in 1998. Mary Jane stopped working full-time from this point on. Wasting no time to grow the family even larger, Madison was welcomed into the world 2 months premature in 1999. She had to spend 2 months in the hospital, which generated more bills the Longos had no way of paying. As usual, Christian appeared to have no comprehension of how deep he was in debt, because after a disagreement at work, he quit his job. He did find employment as a fireplace salesman, but the commission was not good, and Christian was not very good at his job. He did, however, see an opportunity for a cleaning service and started his own company on the side, going so far as hiring a staff. He even convinced his stepfather to invest in the business and took out loans and ran credit with companies to get stock. His lavish lifestyle was complemented with the purchase of a jet ski and a Dodge Durango, although he had no money to pay staff or suppliers. The couple had also defaulted on their mortgage payments, and Mary Jane's parents, who were dependent on the monthly payment, threatened legal action. Mary Jane's family was worried about her, but still did not interfere. Soon, Christian's stepfather would also be swindled by the man he gave his surname to. Christian and Mary Jane would have their first fight when her Ford Taurus was repossessed. Christian must have known that his criminal ways of keeping face was a short-term solution, but instead of being honest with his wife, he drove to a car dealership in Ohio on February 16, 2000. He had forged a false identification document and even had his ID laminated, with the sole purpose to steal a car. At the dealership, he presented his fake ID and took the minivan he had chosen for a ride. Needless to say, he never went back. Mary Jane was ecstatic when she saw the brand new Pontiac Montana in her driveway and was told it was now hers. Christian even told her that he got a great deal because the first payment was not required for the next 90 days. They even took the dealership plates off and replaced them with their vanity plates, which said Kid Van. The car was reported stolen, and afterwards, the salesman would say that nothing about Christian gave away that he would steal the car. The fact that the crime was committed in another state also helped Christian to get away with his crime for a little longer. Christian took on a second job, but he must have been aware that whatever he earned would not be enough to sustain the abundance he was used to. Anyone who has ever done business in and around the construction industry will know that the wait for payment is a laborious process. Contractors are paid when the project is finished, and from there, subcontractors are paid. The loans and credit line at the bank Christian had secured was supposed to keep his company afloat while they waited for the remuneration. But by the time it came to paying salaries and rent, Christian was once again flat broke, despite the fact that the business on paper had been doing very well. Christian wrote a check for a forklift and trailer he wanted for the business, and when the checks bounced, he told the company that wanted to repossess the equipment that both had been in an accident and had been written off. He had actually stolen the pieces of equipment to get hold of more cash flow. He also started forging checks and had become such an accomplished forger that he managed to steal $35,000 before he was caught. A teller had identified him when he tried to cash another bad check, and when he noticed she took too long, he left, but left behind his briefcase and a day planner. Police found Christian at home and confronted him with the fraud. He said he only took back what the company stole from him. Mary Jane was completely taken off guard and terrified for her husband when she discovered that he could receive 14 years in federal prison for each of the forged checks he wrote. The police wasted no time in confiscating Christian's computer and scanner. Christian did not resist because he did not want the police to snoop around and discover others' stolen property. He would eventually be found guilty of 4 felony charges and was bonded out on a $100 bond. He was sentenced to 3 years probation and heavy fines. And as if this was not enough embarrassment enough, Mary Jane had discovered emails indicating that Christian had been having an affair with another woman from the Jehovah's Witnesses. This indiscretion, despite Christian claiming it was only an emotional affair, was the last straw for the organization, and he was officially shunned. He was thereby disallowed from having any contact with members of the church. In being the complete narcissist he was, Christian turned the narrative of the affair around and told Mary Jane that she was no fun and that she failed to meet his physical needs. His stepfather pulled out from the business, and Mary Jane stopped going to the temple because she felt judged by the other members. Her husband was being sued and was more than $100,000 in debt. Christian's next move should come as no surprise. He took out a credit card in his stepfather's name. He spent that money on scuba diving lessons and gear, as well as eye surgery for Mary Jane. Christian tried to forge another credit line, but his stepfather had made the difficult decision to lay charges on the man he raised. Investigators were still building a case against him, but Christian had no intention of being arrested. By the time police arrived at the home to serve the arrest warrant, they discovered the family long gone and the home sold. The Longo family had no idea where they were going. They headed up to Toledo, Ohio, with no money. Christian pawned Mary Jane's engagement ring to be able to afford food and gas. They eventually settled in an abandoned warehouse for an amount that would have easily afforded them an apartment, but he probably did not need to have his credit checked and paid the first month's rent. Mary Jane was worried, and with good reason. They had no furniture. The place was dirty and run down, and the open space not suitable for children. Christian once again promised her a new start, that the setup was temporary, and once again she believed him. He also asked her not to tell anyone where they were. Once again, Christian tried to open a forged account, but detectives had him on their radar and caught wind quickly. Wanted posters of Christian had been distributed, and Mary Jane was only allowed to meet with her sister in public places. Her family was very worried about her and the kids. And soon after their last meeting, Mary Jane's sister discovered her sister's cell phone had been disconnected. This left the family with a feeling of dread that they might never see their loved ones again. Christian next decided to steal a ski boat and trailer, as well as a skip loader. He advertised the items in the local paper in order to make some money, but the very first customer he received to review his stolen goods smelled a rat and immediately informed the police that something was off. Police did investigate, but the ever-confident Christian told them that he had the title for the goods he was selling, but because they had just moved, he was not able to find it at the moment. Police did check the serial number, but since the goods had not yet been reported as stolen, they told Christian they would return later to view the title. When police returned later, Christian and the family had left in such a hurry that they even left Mary Jane's wedding dress behind. They also left the speedboat and trailer behind. Christian was becoming nervous, knowing that a warrant was out for his arrest. The family had traveled across the country, living off stolen checks and sleeping often in tents in isolated places along the way. Mary Jane sent postcards to her family, telling them that Christian had been selected for a 2-month training program. She never called them again, but promised that once they were settled, she would come to visit. They ended up in Oregon, renting motel rooms, where they didn't need to have a background check done. In Newport, he found part-time employment at a Starbucks, where he quickly moved up to a permanent position. He was not popular amongst his fellow employees, claiming he was only working for spending money, and his arrogant nature did not endear him to them. He continued, despite only earning less than $8 an hour, and Christian found a luxury apartment block which he really liked and rented one of the condos for his family. The rent was $12,000 a month, and Christian knew he was going to be evicted after the first month. He believed his big family was the main problem for his financial problems. On December 16, 2001, Christian came home from his shift after midnight. He gave his own account of what occurred, but what we know for sure is that while everyone was asleep in the home, he first strangled Mary Jane to death, and then strangled Madison, the youngest. He placed both their bodies each in a suitcase, which he loaded into his minivan. He then loaded the sleeping bodies of 4-year-old Zachary and 3-year-old Sadie into the car and drove to a bridge where he stopped. First, he disposed of the suitcases by throwing them into the canal. He then first took Zachary, who was still half asleep, tied a pillowcase filled with rocks around his ankle, and threw his oldest son into the water. He then proceeded to do the same with Sadie. During their autopsies, it would later be determined that, due to the frigid water, both children died instantly from heart attacks when their bodies hit the water. He then drove home to an eerily quiet house, where he was completely alone. He would later confess that Madison was not completely dead, and he could hear her moan before he threw the suitcase in the water. During the next couple of days, Christian told his landlord that his wife and kids had gone to Michigan to visit family. He even went to a company Christmas party, where he gifted one of the employees a bottle of Mary Jane's perfume. He also stole another car and dumped the minivan at the dealership he stole his new ride from. He also filled in for a couple of shifts at Starbucks, but Christian's luck was running out. 2 days after the murders, Zachary's body had freed itself from the pillowcase and was discovered by a resident of the local trailer park. The discovery was first figured to be an accident. After establishing there was foul play, he was identified as Christian and Mary Jane's child. Before the rest of Christian's family was discovered, Christian was long gone. On December 23, 2001, the FBI started their investigation. Mary Jane's family had reported them missing after she stopped contacting them. Christian had no plans to go to jail for any crimes he committed. He always admired the work of Michael Finkel and assumed his identity as he made arrangements to flee to Cancun, Mexico. Once there, he continued to pretend to be Michael Finkel, going so far as to write articles about the locals. After arriving in Cancun on December 28, 2001, his face appeared next to Osama bin Laden, and he also appeared on America's Most Wanted. A $50,000 reward was offered for his capture. Christian stayed in a couple of hostels after his arrival, and even met a woman with whom he started a relationship. Christian was living his best life, working during the day and going to parties, drinking and smoking weed at night. But his face on wanted posters and on television screens meant his luck was running out again. More and more people reported sightings of him, and soon the hut where he was staying was raided, and he was finally taken into custody. It was after this arrest that the real Michael Finkel would receive the phone call that would revive his career. Christian was charged with 7 counts of murder, which included 2 for each of his children. During the trial, he would only admit to 2 of the murders, claiming Mary Jane had killed Zachary and Sadie. He claimed he confessed the day before the murders to Mary Jane all his transgressions and crimes, and that she was very upset and angry. Christian claims she had killed the children, and out of anger he had strangled her. After killing her, he saw Madison was still alive, so he killed her too. This was the same tall tale that Chris Watts told the jury about the murder of his family. No one believed it because everyone knew Mary Jane was a good mother. The jury, however, determined that the murders were premeditated. Until the end, Christian wanted to save his image. But on April 6, 2003, Christian Longo was found guilty on all charges. Christian was completely taken off guard and looked stunned at the verdict. Mary Jane's family supported the death penalty. During the sentencing, Christian finally admitted to his part in the annihilation of his family and the murder of all 4 members, but he still received a death sentence for his crimes. While on death row, Michael Finkel started to communicate with Christian. Michael knew he wanted to write a book about the brutal crimes he had committed, and who better to use as a source than the actual murderer. For a while, the two got along very well, and Michael would visit him, write to him, and exchange phone calls whenever they could. Christian admitted to him that pride was the main motivator for all his crimes. He wanted to start over and saw no other way out. Michael Finkel would publish the book True Story Murder, Memoir and Myopia. The book would eventually be adapted into a movie. Part 2, Deadly Deception. Oh, what tangled webs we weave when first we conspire to deceive. We all have told a lie here and there, and before you go saying, "No, not me," let me categorically tell you that according to TED, the average person lies no less than 10 times a day, and often as much as 200 times a day. I have a feeling that it's a bit more for politicians, but that is just my own humble personal opinion. We tell little white lies to avoid confrontation, or we embellish stories to make it more exciting. Lying is part of human nature, and the art of deception truly an art. The subject of our last part took deception to a whole new level. I'm not talking about telling your wife the dress looks great when the pattern looks like your grandmother's sofa upholstery, or telling your kid the injection won't hurt a bit. The deception Jean-Claude Romand orchestrated was far beyond what anyone who knew him could ever imagine. To say he was ordinary is the understatement of the year. He grew up with doting parents in the eastern part of France, and his childhood was unremarkable. Jean-Claude Romand came into this world on February 11, 1952, and throughout his childhood years, he remained ordinary and bland. Some of his peers would even describe him as dull. His parents adored him and would dote on and coddle the young man, bending to all his whims. He was an average student and would originally start a course in agriculture, but would later change it to medicine. It is while enrolled at the University of Lyon that Jean-Claude would fall madly in love with Florence Corlett. Florence was a distant cousin and also enrolled in medicine. She was, however, not really that interested in Jean-Claude. Only after a mutual friend vouched for him would Florence consider going on a date with him. The two started seeing each other, but near the end of his second year, she called the whole thing off, claiming that she did not have time for both her studies and a boyfriend. Jean-Claude was devastated. It was during this time that he started with his greatest act of duplicity. His reasons for why it all started varies, but during his final second-year exam, he did not show up to take the test. He also failed to show up for the makeup exam and started to isolate himself, gaining an unhealthy amount of weight from all the fast food he was ordering. As long as he was studying, his parents allowed him unrestricted access to their bank accounts in order for him not to worry about anything but his studies. By having access to their money, Jean-Claude was able to begin fabricating castles in the sky, and for 18 years he managed to make everyone around him believe that it was real. His lies were strange and unusual, but effective. He, for instance, vanished one night at a nightclub, only to reappear hours later, covered in blood and bruises, claiming that unknown men attacked him, beat him, then stuck him in the boot of his own car and drove around for 3 hours. The story sounded too wild to be a lie, but it was. He also told people that he had cancer and had to go for treatment. Being the compassionate people he had in his life, his friends and family rallied around him, and Florence even reconsidered her decision to break up with Jean-Claude. It was, however, not the grandest of his deceits. For 12 years, Jean-Claude would enroll in his second year, get a student card, take notes at the classes, and basically bluffed his way through less than 2 decades. He managed to pass his final exam, since he attended the classes, but technically, he only had 1 year of medical school behind him. While studying, he married Florence, and they had 2 children, Caroline and Antoine. At the end of his mock studies, he pretended to have gotten employment at the prestigious World Health Organization in Switzerland. As luck would have it, his parents never changed the arrangement, and Jean-Claude had still all the access to their funds. After the sale of his flat in Lyon, he conned his parents into keeping the proceeds of the sale. The problem with building a life on a foundation of lies is that the truth can come out at any moment and pull the rug from under your feet. Despite the salary Florence was earning, her income could never justify the kind of lifestyle an esteemed researcher and doctor could afford. When his parents announced that they were going to retire, Jean-Claude leaped at the golden opportunity to cash in on their good fortune. He successfully sold the story that he was, as a member of the WHO staff, privy to some great investment opportunities, offering as much as 18% interest. Trusting their son, who was a doctor after all, they handed over their entire nest egg. Jean-Claude had effectively started his own Ponzi scheme. Next to fall victim to his greed was an uncle, and then Florence's parents. All the while, Jean-Claude would leave his house every morning dressed as if he was on his way to work. He would go into the actual WHO office, chat to security guards, and take some of the pamphlets to leave in his car and at his house, using the literature as proof of his employment. He would then go for a walk in the woods or have coffee in the park. He refused to give Florence a contact number, only giving her a number to call to alert him via pager that she was looking for him. She was told to give a number between 1 and 9, depending on the urgency of the call. His behavior was odd, but his friends and family wrote it off as work-related. He would also often leave for business trips for a couple of days. He would usually just book himself into a motel near an airport and collect gifts at the duty-free stands. He would use the time to do research on whatever country he claimed to be visiting, and not once did anyone catch on that Jean-Claude had an entire life of lies. As with most poorly thought through plans, his luck was going to run out sooner or later. It began when Florence's father asked for some of the money he had invested with Jean-Claude. He wanted to buy himself a nice car and spoil himself in his golden years. Jean-Claude was such a magnificent liar that it's difficult to believe that, shortly after making the request for his money, Florence's father fell down a flight of stairs while alone with Jean-Claude. He would later deny having had anything to do with his father-in-law's death, but the death put him in a substantially better financial position. Florence's mother also wanted to sell the house with all its belongings, and by now Jean-Claude had gained a reputation as a financial advisor, and the widow decided to leave all the headaches of bookkeeping and budgeting to her beloved son-in-law. As if the conduct of this loser has not left a bitter enough taste in your mouth, let me tell you how loathsome a creature he really is. A relative was dying of cancer, and Jean-Claude was generous enough to offer to sell him a very experimental drug they were working on at the WHO. The drug, which might or might not work, cost about $15,000 per dose, and that roughly translates to $16,000 in 1990. Jean-Claude sold him 4 doses of the placebo to the relative, but of course they passed away. Time and time again, as I did the research for the story, I kept on thinking, someone must have known something was off. I finally came to the conclusion that all his victims were just honestly good people, and unlike true crime junkies like you and me, they never anticipated malice or harm from a loved one. His online photos reveal not a monster, but an ordinary, slightly camera-shy family man. Yet his deceit ran so deep that he even bought gifts for his family on behalf of his imaginary colleagues at the WHO. Florence would write thank you notes, and Jean-Claude would offer to hand-deliver them. If you think this is the height of Jean-Claude's deception, you are sadly mistaken. It was during a social gathering of friends that Jean-Claude met Chantal Delalande. Both she and Jean-Claude were married, but he fell head over heels in love with her. When he discovered that she was in the process of getting divorced, he decided that he just had to have her. She, on the other hand, had a reputation of being a flirt and did not have any idea how Jean-Claude felt. He started to woo her with a bouquet of flowers and then took her for a fancy meal. When he finally got enough courage to blurt out, "I love you," she told him gently that she was not interested. He was married and also not physically much of a catch. Jean-Claude was well aware of her need for status and won her heart over briefly with a gold and emerald ring and promises to introduce her to the elite, his imaginary circle. The affair did not last long. In the meanwhile, Chantal had received over 9 million francs in her divorce settlement, and Jean-Claude offered to invest it for her. The windfall came for him at exactly the right time, since he had depleted everyone else's savings. Jean-Claude would take her on extravagant trips and buy her expensive gifts, all the while paying for them with her money. He burned through Chantal's money, and this time there was no other possible way to continue the con. Without a healthy cash injection, the smoke and mirrors would not be able to hide the truth behind the illusion. Chantal had been suspicious for a while and eventually asked Jean-Claude for her money back. Part of the reason she agreed to the investment is that she would have immediate access to her funds at any moment. Jean-Claude placated her for a while, but the pressure was on, and he knew the clock was ticking on the life he had fabricated. On January 9th, 1993, he bought a rifle and ammunition, as well as a stun gun and gas canisters. He went home and claims not to remember what happened next. According to forensics and court testimony, Jean-Claude had waited for his wife to go to bed. He had taken a marble rolling pin from their kitchen and bludgeoned her to death. He then casually got into bed next to her and slept to the following morning. He woke the children in the morning, telling them that their mother was ill and sleeping in. After feeding them breakfast, He spent the next couple of hours watching cartoons with 7-year-old Caroline and 5-year-old Antoine. Under the lie of having to take her temperature, which is usually administered anally in France, Jean-Claude took his daughter into her room and told her to lie face down on her bed. He collected his rifle, attached the silencer he had purchased earlier, and shot little Caroline in the back, piercing her heart. He repeated the same actions with her brother. After fielding another call from his mistress for her money, he went to his parents for lunch. Personally, I would not be able to eat after murdering my family and planning to kill more people. But Jean-Claude apparently had a good appetite. While his father was bent down over an air vent he was busy fixing, Jean-Claude attached the silencer to his firearm once again and shot him in the back of his head. He tried to hide from his mother to launch a surprise attack, and something went wrong because his mother would be the only victim that, due to the gunshot in her chest, saw her son kill her. He then killed the dog and left to prepare for a date with Chantal. She had become more impatient about getting her money back, and Jean-Claude promised high and low that she would have it the following day. To divert attention off the topic of money, he asked her to join him for a romantic dinner. After he picked her up, the two drove around for a while, and Jean-Claude pretended near a wooded area that he was lost. He stopped the car, and Chantal got out of the car, only to be greeted with fumes from a gas canister. Followed by the jolt of his stun gun, she managed to keep her wits about her, and Jean-Claude immediately regretted his attack on her, pleading that it was an honest mistake. Chantal, having noticed the electric cord lying next to him, played it cool, and as the stammering Jean-Claude tried to explain his actions, all she focused on was to get safely home. After he dropped her off, he called her like the villain in a thriller and told her that he could have killed her and her 2 daughters if he really wanted to, but that he did not want to. Chantal must by then have been frightened out of her mind and utterly confused, and she told him all she wanted was the money he still owed her. Jean-Claude realized that he had run out of luck, and after returning to his home, he took a handful of expired sleeping tablets, covered the home in petrol, and set the place on fire, but not before ensuring that there was already movement in the street, and that his window was open for an easy rescue. Emergency workers saved the unconscious Jean-Claude, but when they reached the bodies of the other victims, 2 things were clear. They died long before the fire started, and definitely not from smoke inhalation. Suspicion fell immediately on Jean-Claude, but he refused to admit any wrongdoing. He was sent for a psychiatric evaluation, and it won't be surprising to hear that he suffered from classic narcissistic personality disorder. The report on his mental health emphasized that Jean-Claude had an obsession with what others thought of him. During the trial, his jigsaw of lies came apart, and the world learned how deep his deceit really went. He showed no remorse, nor did he offer any. June 22, 1996. Jean-Claude Romand was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in 22 years. Apparently he was a role model prisoner, and he even managed to find God behind bars. But frankly, knowing how well Jean-Claude can lie, I would not put too much stock in it. He has asked for forgiveness, but this plea sounds as hollow as the accolades he pretended to have. It did manage to get him early release in May 2019, and for the following 2 years, he lived in a monastery. He has been granted complete freedom in May 2021, and probably has changed his name to pursue a new life. The man who wanted fame and fortune begged for anonymity, and try as we might, we could not find his current residence. Perhaps it's better that way, because I am sure that, like me, there are people out there who think he never should have seen the free world. Epilogue. Sidney Poitier has always represented to millions of people class and humility, and his quotes are legendary. The one that has always stood out to me is that basically, at the end of the day, a man is measured by the way he takes care of his family. The men we discuss today would never be called real men. Their selfish actions destroyed not just innocent lives, but affected the communities in which they were carried out. The family unit is, without a doubt, one of the most important parts of society. We have far too many boy children being raised by single mothers, and far too many girls falling pregnant before 16 for me to believe that we are on the right track. Life often feels as if it's traveling far over the speed limit. But take the time today to grab your loved ones, look them in the eye, and say, "Hey, how are you doing? I love you. I am here for you." This episode was written by Misdemeanor. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.